Hi, this is Dr. J and Dr. Heather Davidson. Thank you so much for participating in the Chronic Lyme Disease Summit number 3.
I am so excited for you to be listening to all these amazing interviews my husband has put together. And for those of you dealing with Lyme disease, I totally can relate because Lyme disease has impacted a huge part of my life. And today, I am the healthiest I've ever been in my entire life. And I just want to remind you that never lose that little piece of hope.
Yeah, and help support the mission on getting the word out about Lyme disease by sharing or purchasing this event. Hello, this is Dr. J. Davidson from drjdavidson.com. I'm excited to welcome you to this very special segment of the Chronic Lyme Disease Summit number 3. According to the CDC, there are more people affected with Lyme disease each year than breast cancer. Today, my special guest is Scott Forsgren, and we're going to be exploring detoxification, not to be overlooked in recovering from chronic Lyme disease. But before we do a little bit about Scott Forsgren, FDNP, is a health coach, blogger, podcaster, health writer, and advocate. He is the editor and founder of BetterHealthGuy.com, where he shares his 20-year journey through the world of Lyme disease, mold illness, and a myriad of factors that chronic illness often entails. His podcast, Better Health Guy Blogcast, interviews many of the leaders in the field and is available on his website, YouTube, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and Spotify. He's been interviewed on Lyme Ninja Radio, Lyme Less, Live More, Essential Medcast, Beyond Wellness Radio, FDN Radio, and many more. He's lectured on his recovery from chronic illness as an invited speaker on the Klinghardt Academy and Autism One, and both previous Chronic Lyme Disease Summits, number 1 and 2. Scott, you might be the only guy that's been on all 3 of them. So.
Awesome.
He's been fortunate to have written for publications such as the Townsend Newsletter, Public Health Alert, Explore, and others. He serves on the board of directors of Limelight Foundation, which provides treatment grants to children and young adults dealing with Lyme disease. Today, Scott is grateful for his current state of health and all that he's learned through his life-changing journey. Scott, needless to say, welcome to the Chronic Lyme Disease Summit number 3.
Thank you so much, Dr. J. It's an honor to be here.
Well, I have to say, Scott, anytime I bring your name up with somebody in the Lyme disease world, in the functional medicine world, people always think you are the most genuine, nicest guy. I have yet to hear anything bad. So I have to give you kudos that's just how you're wired. And probably one of the reasons I keep asking, I'm like, Scott, got another summit. I want to have you on. You're like, absolutely. So
thank you.
With your, 20-year journey, mold and Lyme, I mean, how important is detoxification within this?
So if you had asked me this at the beginning of my journey, I would have said exactly the opposite. I think initially I would have said that dealing with the infections was number 1, dealing with toxicity was next, and then dealing with the mental, emotional component was really down on my list pretty far. And so today I would say it's exactly the opposite. I think we need to, number 1, look at the mental, emotional aspects of health and recovery. Then we need to look at detoxification, and then the microbial burden really is the lowest thing on my list at this point. So this shift in my perspective really came from Dr. Klinghardt and his work with the Klinghardt axiom, which he's talked about many times in the past. And when you look at the 5 levels of healing, if you look at the physical level of the 5 levels of healing, detoxification is really the most important thing that we do there. And so we know that microbes love toxic environments. We know that indirectly, I actually view detoxification as a long-term antimicrobial strategy. And so the toxins that are within us are bad for our immune system. And so where there are toxins, there's less immune surveillance and less immune competence, and thus higher levels of these microbes. So if we change the terrain, that makes us less hospitable to these microbes. And if all we do is focus on kill, 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 the minute we stop killing, immediately those bugs move back into our body again, or they take over again. And so we really need to focus on fixing the terrain so that we can achieve longer term health stability and be less likely to manifest these ongoing microbial overgrowths. And so detoxification really helps to support the immune system so that our bodies can better manage microbial exposures the way that we really were intended to. And so when we look at Dr. Klinghart's model of treatment, he talks about toxic burden, and that comes first before addressing microbes, and that's really intentional on his part. It's not the bugs that are the problem, it's really the terrain and our immune systems, both over and under reaction to the bugs, that create the issue. And so if we fix the terrain, we can really fix or significantly improve the underlying problem.
And so toxicity is what you see as a really big factor to negatively affect the terrain. So detoxification is one way to really stabilize that terrain.
Absolutely. I think that detox in general is always or almost always the most significant physical body factor in someone dealing with something like Lyme. And so I think almost everyone dealing with a chronic illness in our modern environment, there is a degree of toxicity that's playing a role there, especially in Lyme disease and mold illness. The challenge is there's so many different kinds of toxins that we're exposed to. And so we can't focus on just one thing. We can't say, well, it's all heavy metals. There's chemicals and pesticides and mold toxins and a host of other things that we come in contact with on a daily basis. And so we really need to look at a broad detoxification program that can help us address all of those toxins and, as much as possible, regain health from something like Lyme disease or chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia or whatever the label is that's put on the symptoms that a person's experiencing. And so there may be a need for more specific interventions around specific toxins at various stages of treatment, but I think it's critical that throughout an entire treatment program that there is a generalized detoxification strategy that's in place, and that should be in place at all times. And so I think it's also important to really look at the symptoms of Lyme disease overlap with the symptoms of mold exposure and mold toxicity, and they overlap with the symptoms of heavy metals and other toxins as well. So we can't really look at symptoms and say, oh, look, I have Lyme disease because I've got all these symptoms. We have to look at the many factors that play a role and not only look at the microbial aspect, but look at detoxification as well, look at our environment, look at our moldy house, and so on. And so I think, yes, detoxification is absolutely critical. I think that most or all of us that are dealing with something like Lyme have a toxicity component that has to be dealt with. And I think that it's actually very significant, and it's a significant burden and weight on the body that once we can lift it, that the body then can start to right itself and find its balance.
Well, you're definitely speaking my language here. I love that. So when you mention toxin, I mean, as I just think about kind of a general definition, I'm thinking a chemical or a substance that attacks, or causes inflammation, damages tissue. What would you put top of the list for toxins that somebody with Lyme disease could be exposed to, or the top factors that you see clinically?
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly put mold exposure very, very high on that list. I think it's really important to look at the fact that many of us have detoxification capacities that are probably not ideal. And this may be somewhat related to genetics, but I think it's really more epigenetically that we're now exposed to metals and toxins and molds and other things that kind of lead us to not being able to detoxify efficiently. And so then we start to develop symptoms. And so I think that the most important thing that we need to do is first avoid these toxins as much as possible. And surprisingly, it's not something that people actually think a lot about. So if we don't have the toxins entering the body in the first place, we don't need to deal with detoxifying them. There are certainly toxins that are produced within us as well. So endogenous toxins from microbes, from overgrowths of candida and other pathogens, Borrelia as well. So we have to consider that as well. But from a perspective of external toxins, there is a lot we can do to minimize exposure. And so I think it's important to step back and look at the basics and look at air and water and food. We know that the air has lots of different toxins in it. We can't do a whole lot about external air exposure, but the air that's in our internal environment, what can we do to improve that? We know that we're exposed to heavy metals and other chemicals and pesticides from breathing outside air. We know that water can be a source of toxicity, especially if it's not being filtered appropriately. We know that food has many toxins, heavy metals in some cases, antibiotics, different hormones, and things of that nature. Many people have talked about glyphosate being an exposure, a toxin that we get from various foods that we consume. And so I think it's important to look at how do we clean up the air quality as much as possible. Again, some of that's out of our control when we're talking about external environments. There's a few things like, not living in an area where planes are flying overhead all the time. Here in California, we've had a lot of fires recently, and so I know people have had to really step up their detoxification focus from the toxins that potentially they were exposed to as a result of all of that. But again, the indoor air is really where I think we get more of these toxic exposures. And so building materials and volatile organic compounds and cleaning products and dust and animal dander and things like that. But certainly the mold and mold associated toxins, I think, are very, very high on that list. I do think it's important to have some kind of a good air filtration system in your home, unless you absolutely know and have tested that mold is not an issue. And unfortunately, it is a big issue for many people. So there's a number of great air filtration systems. I think I have 4 air filtration systems and whole house air filtration in my home, and certainly think that that's an important thing to consider. And then when it comes to water, obviously not drinking tap water. There's so many different exposures that we get from tap water. So filtering the water, I tend to use a carbon filter, just a basic carbon filter or a Berkey filter. And then I also like to structure the water, not drinking from plastic bottles, but using glass bottles where possible. Lots of different options that people can consider there as well. And then looking at food, avoiding mercury and things like fish that are higher, to be known to be higher in certain concentrations of mercury, the larger fish particularly, pesticides as well. People think that pesticides can be washed off, but there are pesticides that are actually part of the food product. And so eating organically, especially for the things that are on the Dirty Dozen list from the Environmental Working Group, I think that's a very wise choice and really almost an absolute requirement in this environment if we want to be healthy. So thinking about where are your meats coming from. I do this a lot at restaurants and ask them if they have antibiotic and hormone-free meats. And surprisingly, some of them have actually made some improvements and adjustments based on inquiries like that. So it's good to ask if you're eating out, where's the food coming from? What's the quality of the food? And so I think it's absolutely critical that we consider these basic sources of exposure and just eliminate them as much as possible. Air, water, and food are some of the biggest ones that we do have some control over. And then looking at, what cleaning products are people using? What personal care products are we using? What's our dental material exposure? Do we have amalgams? What are we cooking with? Antacids and antiperspirants that may be sources of aluminum, for example. What our pipes in our homes are made of. I mean, there's a lot of these things that we can really think of and make some improvements to minimize the toxins that are coming in. And so if the sink is already overflowing because the drain is plugged up, we know that we're going to turn the water off. But when we know we're toxic, we don't often think about reducing these exposures. And so I think the challenge every day, and it is still a major focus for me personally, is keeping a higher level of toxins moving out of the body as compared to what we're being exposed to and what's coming in. And it is a big challenge, but it is something that is really critical for us to regain our health. And so mold is a whole different animal. And I think we should talk about that a little bit in the context of toxicity as well.
Yeah. Wow. So much info there. So my mind's thinking, okay, 4 air filters. What are the ones that Scott likes here?
Well, over time, it's kind of changed. I have Austin Air, I have a whole house air filtration system, I have Air Oasis, I have IQ Air, and I have an IntelliPure. And I think they're all good in different ways. I tend to right now really like the IntelliPure because it's a combination of filtration like you get in something like the IQ Air, but also the light-based purification like you maybe get from something like the Air Oasis. So I've been exploring a little bit the IntelliPure, but I think IQ Air, Air Oasis, those are also great tools as well. Okay.
Yeah, I've got the Austin Air, one in my bedroom, one in my daughter's, and then have an Air Oasis right here in my office.
Awesome. So I do too.
It's all important, So when you're talking about mold, are you talking about, so mold's in the biotoxin category, same as Lyme, like living toxin. But is it more of like what mold does to our immune system, or like the mycotoxin that mold releases that you feel like is such a factor with Lyme?
Yeah, so I think that in people dealing with Lyme disease, it's surprising to me how significant the mold issue is. I would say probably half or more of people that are not recovering from Lyme with all of the things that they're doing have some mold exposure that's contributing to their condition. So it could be where they're living, where they're working, where they're going to school, any place that's had a water intrusion. And we're not talking about outdoor environment molds, though those can affect some people, but we're really talking about molds that are out of balance in an indoor environment. And so when you look at the things in a water damaged building, it's actually a long list. It's not just mycotoxins. And in fact, some say that the mycotoxins are only a small part of the overall inflammagens that we get exposed to. So there's microbial volatile organic compounds. I was actually surprised to even see mycoplasma and chlamydia pneumonia on that list as well, of things that are found in water damaged buildings in higher amounts. And so those are also pathogens that many people with Lyme disease kind of chronically tend to deal with as part of their overall microbial soup as well. So I think in the case where someone has Lyme disease, that exploring mold should be step number one. Before they do anything else, they need to know that their environment is safe for their recovery. And if mold is an issue, moving or remediating or mitigating is a top priority. And I would say moving is a smaller percentage at this point. My understanding is that about 50 to 70% of buildings in this country would have a level of mold that would contribute to an inflammatory illness in people that are genetically predisposed, which is about 25%. So if you have that genetic predisposition, it's not necessarily easy to find environments that are completely safe. And so remediating tends to be kind of a focus, unless it's a really significant issue. And I think that treating Lyme when mold is part of the puzzle, it's much more difficult. It's an uphill battle. You really have to get that off the table first. And if people aren't progressing with their Lyme treatment, I would say mold is one of the top explanations for that. And so I do think we talked about air filtration. I think that's an important option and something most people should do, but it isn't the solution. You have to still remove the source. And in many cases, the air filtration can help you make some progress, but it's not by itself generally enough to completely solve the issue. You still need to find where the mold is coming from and get it remediated as well. And then detoxification, certainly incorporating things like binders, and there's various mold protocols that people are doing. I think that's important as well. So removing yourself from the exposure. Binders, very critical. And then there's other steps depending on certain lab markers that may make sense if you've had mold related illness as well. And so I would say for people that are living in a water damaged building, that indoor environment is often the top or a top contributor to their body burden of toxicity and to their inflammation and overall symptoms. And so I've said this for years, but I just can't stress enough how important it is to make sure your environment is safe for your recovery when you're dealing with something like Lyme disease. And mold and EMFs are certainly at the top of things you need to consider in creating a healthy environment.
So important. I can't stress that enough too, is mold. Like if you hit a wall and you're like, oh, this protocol's not working anymore, or worked for 7 days, and all of a sudden I'm getting the opposite reaction. Like my brain thinks mold. Like make sure your environment is safe. And a couple gold nuggets that I heard in there: if you test co-infections and mycoplasma pneumonia, like you said, or chlamydia pneumonia comes up, you really want to look at the mold side, because I agree, like that is, for whatever reason, correlating to mold very strongly.
Absolutely.
Where do EMFs fit into the picture, and do EMFs affect mold too?
So it's kind of funny, the whole EMF discussion, because 12 years ago now, when I started listening to Dr. Klinghardt, he talked about EMFs and EMRs and the impact that they had on health. I've actually slept in a Faraday cage for the last 12 years, ever since I met Dr. Klinghardt in 2006, in order to minimize exposure to these EMFs. And so people have for years laughed at him about some of these ideas. And now 2018, everyone's talking about EMFs and EMRs. And so it's kind of sad and somewhat comical that his ideas that weren't so popular then are certainly becoming more accepted now. And so I know that we people seem to be more sensitive to EMFs if they have a higher burden of heavy metals. And so I think that's an important consideration as well, where detoxification can help to make people less sensitive to electromagnetic fields. I've seen people that have had, significant burning sensations living in their home after a smart meter was put on their neighbor's house that were able to move past that with focused heavy metal detoxification. Dr. Klinghardt has talked about how EMFs lead to more aggressive molds and to a higher output of biotoxins and mycotoxins from those molds when they're exposed to EMFs. And so I actually wonder if anybody's looked at the connection between EMFs in our environment from cell phones and other things, cell phone towers and so on, and the potential increase in water damaged buildings. I suspect there would be a connection, but I've never seen anyone actually look at that to see, is that part of why we now have so many people that are dealing with mold illness as well. And so the microbes within us also, some have suggested that they also are threatened by electromagnetic fields and also then become more aggressive and put out more toxins to attempt to protect themselves. And so Dr. Klinghardt, in one of his recent talks, has really suggested that the heavy metals is what can, if we focus on removing the metals, we can really collapse the microbial burden and also make us less EMF sensitive. And so he's talked about how EMFs also limit our ability to detoxify as well. So this whole thing is really interrelated. The toxicity, the EMFs, the microbes, and minimizing EMFs in the environment is just another thing that we need to do to make sure that we're optimizing our treatment path. And so I would say mold is a top priority. Mitigating EMFs is certainly high up on the list as well. We have to do everything we can do to set the stage for an optimal outcome. And for me, from an EMF perspective, this means no cordless phones in the house, no Wi-Fi unless it's absolutely critical, and then turn it off when you don't need it, minimal cell phone exposure, and then using something like, it's a little extreme, but I think it's very helpful, the silver lined cloth, or some people will go as far as to use graphite paints, particularly in their bedroom environment, because that's when it's most critical to reduce EMFs while you're sleeping and restoring and repairing.
Yeah, we did that with my daughter's bedroom,
Awesome.
And it was a lot of work because it's black paint and it takes a couple coats to, cover that up. But it's like, in the end, health is all that matters. But what I'm hearing from you, Scott, is, okay, EMFs, EMR, that this is something that can be basically a source to your toxicity. So Wi-Fi and Bluetooth can actually make the bugs inside of us, can maybe turn even, commensal or good bugs into bad bugs, but then can potentially make more toxins. So maybe instead of us just focusing detoxifying like supplement wise, we also want to look at the environment as a source to help speed the process up too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say EMFs are themselves a toxin that result in production of further toxins. And so I do put them in the realm of toxins we need to avoid and minimize. But yes, not only are they themselves toxic to us, but then the microbes within us and around us also produce other toxins that affect us as well. So it's a bit of a double whammy.
So with toxicity, do we just assume everybody's toxic, or what's like your favorite way to understand toxicity amount in somebody?
I think if you were to assume that, you probably would be pretty right on that everyone, unfortunately, everyone listening to this is probably somewhat toxic. And so I would say in someone with chronic Lyme, I don't know that I've ever seen anyone where toxicity wasn't an issue to some degree, and generally a significant issue. And so, there's lots of testing that people can do, but I think we should assume that a detoxification program needs to be part of every protocol. It's going to be something that our body will appreciate. And even if we don't know to what extreme, it should still be part of a well-planned protocol for recovering health. And so we need to make sure that, of course, this is guided by a medical professional, but everyone should focus on detox support. And I would say, we see a rise in chronic health challenges today. Genes don't explain that. It takes a long time for genes to actually change. And so I think it's really the epigenetics, or the influencers of the genes, which is the toxicity in the environment, the chemicals and heavy metals and pesticides and all of these things, the EMFs even, Poor nutrition is another one that I think is important. These things are affecting our genetic expression from an epigenetic level. And so I think the good thing is, what really feels empowering to me is that we can improve a lot of those things. It's not that, oh, you have certain genes and thus you're never going to get well, but we can really feel empowered by starting to reduce our toxic burden so that gene expression is improved. And then coming back to testing, certainly provoked urine metal testing has been around for a long time. The urine porphyrin testing is another one that Dr. Klinghardt uses in some cases. Hair testing has its pros and cons. Some of the functional medicine practitioners now are starting to use the oligoscan, which is a device that can be used in the office to get a sense for heavy metal toxicity. And so that's a tool that's available to us now. Quicksilver Scientific has the TRI test as well. And then for toxins like some of the mold related issues, Great Plains has a test for that area. Real Time Labs has a test in that area as well. And both Great Plains and US Biotech also have environmental toxicity testing, like the GPL Tox panel, for example. And so I think, coming back to mold, because I think that's just so critical, I think it is important to do an ERMI, or environmental relative moldiness index test, in the environment that you're in. But then some practitioners feel that looking at the mycotoxins in the urine can also be helpful. It is a debated area. There is not consensus yet. Some practitioners are on the side of it being very helpful. Some feel that it's not helpful. In my personal experience, when I was re-exposed to mold in late 2015, I did find this type of testing to be very helpful. And so I think it is something to explore with people's practitioner. Certainly there's blood testing, but I don't think that shows us a lot. If we're looking at liver, kidneys, and so on, by the time there's something to show up on conventional blood tests, we're probably already pretty far down that kind of stressed state already. And I would say my personal preference would be to combine these functional medicine labs with some system of energetic testing, be that Dr. Klinghardt's autonomic response testing or something similar to that, but looking at it both from a functional lab perspective and also what are the things that are energetically stressing the body. And then also having someone like a building biologist come out, not only to test for the potential of mold, but to test for EMFs. And so what are the levels of EMFs and what are some of the things we can do to mitigate? And so I think testing, EMFs, there are meters people can buy, but if you're really doing it properly, there's 4 or 5 different meters that you need to capture all of the potential issues. And so I also think doing testing in that realm is something that can be very helpful. And so I think to kind of summarize here, why we can support the body's ability to excrete these toxins, that's certainly a really good thing. And it is a critical part of any response to our modern environment. So we need to do the testing, we need to do the detox, and it's just something that we need to incorporate in everyone's protocol.
And it seems like, with all the different sources that you just mentioned, this isn't just a one and done. This is more of going to be longer term, kind of a lifelong process, or where do you see detox fitting in?
Well, one and done would be nice, but I do hear people say, oh, well, I couldn't have metals because I did 5 IV chelation 6 years ago, and so that's already been done. I think generally, while there are cases where IV chelation can be helpful, I think generally that's kind of a short-term solution for a more acute problem. It's probably not a long-term solution. And so I do think detoxification is lifelong, every day, as long as we're breathing, as long as we want to live and be healthy. And so it is one of those things that sometimes people feel like it's overwhelming to think that you have to do this every day. But I would say that we need to focus on detoxification really for a lifetime, unless society wakes up and realizes that reducing toxicity in the environment would benefit all of us. But I'm not holding my breath at this point. I'm not seeing a lot of positive shifts in that direction. And then ironically, the fact that we're still breathing even adds to our toxicity. So there's just so many toxins that we're exposed to that it is something that I feel like is a daily and lifelong focus.
I agree. And it's really set up based on our current environment. Like there's more toxins today than ever. And it just doesn't really even give us the option of like, oh, should I really detox or not? It's like, I really think you're like have to, So I'm totally on that same page. At what level do toxins or toxicity really affect like inflammation? Because I hear so much from practitioners and researchers about, it's really about, getting inflammation down, like reducing it at the cellular level.
Yeah, this is an area where Chris Shade has really helped me to understand this. And so I think it's really a two-way street. I think toxicity, metals particularly, can lead to inflammation throughout the body. And so the more toxic that we become from all of these different sources of toxicity, the more inflamed we are. Aluminum, for example, increases inflammation. Dr. Klinghardt has talked and lectured often about the fact that the degree to which a person with Lyme disease becomes symptomatic correlates very closely to the level of their aluminum toxicity. And so chronic inflammation makes it more difficult for us to detoxify as well. If we're chronically inflamed, we become toxin retention, or move into a toxin retention pattern essentially. And so inflammation inhibits our ability to eliminate toxins as it downregulates our natural detox pathways. And so this is an area I think people should listen to some of the lectures from Dr. Shade. He talks about detoxification and inflammation being a teeter-totter, essentially, that when you're in a state of chronic inflammation, you're in that chronic toxin retention pattern. And so we really have to focus on both detoxification, but also inflammation. And then if we take it a little bit further, the chronic infections also impact our ability to detoxify, in part due to the body's response to them. So the body responds with inflammation to the microbes, which then makes it more difficult for us to be able to detoxify. So now we've got, inflammation impairing detoxification in several ways. And Dr. Shade talks about detoxification being more the antioxidant side of things, where inflammation is more the pro-oxidant response to microbes. And if we turn up that pro-oxidant side, that turns down the antioxidant side. So if we turn up inflammation and microbial response by the body, that turns down our ability to detoxify. So if we really want to make progress and we want to improve our health, we have to detoxify, but we also have to consider ways to reduce chronic inflammation. And then the more we detox, the less inflamed we are, and the less inflamed we are, the more we can detox. So again, it's kind of this circle.
Yeah, that's what I was hearing in there. I'm like, okay, we get toxins, that triggers inflammation, and then the more inflammation, the less you can detox. It's like, that's definitely sounds like one of those downward spirals that's not advantageous. So bringing in, because you mentioned the microbial side of it can also affect inflammation. Earlier on, you mentioned how really you want to look at detoxification earlier as kind of an indirect treatment for antimicrobial. Can you touch on that a little bit more?
Yeah, so people have talked about, this was another area Dr. Klinghardt talked about probably a decade ago, and I think it's gained interest over the years, where candida, for example, in the body can bind with heavy metals, and that may actually be a protective response. So rather than having these heavy metals affecting the body in more significant ways, the body may allow some candida overgrowth in order to bind with the metals. And so we look at metals that are bound by candida. They're not then moving through the body. We can also look at parasites is another good example, and you've actually lectured on this as well, but Dr. Klinghardt talks about how heavy metals are concentrated in parasites. And so the level of parasites that we have in the body is also an indicator for pollutants of the parasitic host. And so the parasites themselves can reduce the levels of toxins in our tissues by concentrating them within their own bodies. And so if we think of candida and parasites, generally people say, oh, these are bad things and we need to get rid of them. But there is a balance. There are some bad things, but there's also some good things that they do for us. And so they're not entirely bad, and they do to some extent serve a purpose. And so if we focus on detoxification, heavy metal detoxification, particularly here, over the long term, we can shift the terrain internally so that we don't need these organisms to protect us. We don't need the candida. We don't need the parasites. And so through detoxification, we are indirectly reducing our body burden of microbes at the same time, and we're allowing the immune system to better respond to the remaining microbes that are still present. So it all comes back to the terrain, and if we can focus on the terrain, we have less and less of a need for these microbes to be there, oftentimes supporting us in some ways that are also positive.
That's a big thought you just said, is really like these critters, bugs, pathogens can actually serve us, like they're actually serving us, and which I feel as if, okay, you look kind of through like my wife's journey, obviously your journey, like early on, I don't feel like I could see that at all. It's like, man, this is damaging. It's taking my life away. But I really believe that now. Like, yeah, parasites are sponges for heavy metals. So if you have a really big burden, that can really be serving you for them to be grabbing on. Obviously, there's negative effects then of those, but that's a big statement. It really kind of comes back.
It is a mindset shift for sure.
Yeah, and it comes back to what you said first, like mindset first, detox, and then microbes. That was the order?
Yeah, I mean, we're never going to improve our health by battling with something, right? I mean, battling with a microbe and having a kill mentality to get well. Unfortunately, I just never see that working in Lyme disease. You have to have a much broader perspective.
And that was something, I can't remember if it was the Lyme number 1 or Lyme number 2 interview when you had said, like, this whole idea that we're in a battle with it. That was so profound for me. And I really want to thank you for that, because that's kind of what we've been taught in our culture, right? Like, oh, I've got this and I'm going to beat it. It's like, why is there a battle? Like, what about understanding that maybe it's serving us in a manner and we need to, go farther upstream and then, almost thank it. Like, thank you,
absolutely.
Thank you, parasites, for what you were doing binding metals. I no longer need you, thank you.
Well, and people don't realize if we're somewhere between 1-to-1 and 10-to-1 microbes to human cells, I mean, the microbes are not the enemy. We couldn't live without them. So we have to be able to create tolerance and have an appropriate interaction between our immune system and these microbes, because they're not going away. They're not something we can eradicate. And if we did eradicate all of the microbes within us, we couldn't survive. So.
Yeah. Well, like you're just saying, if there's, candida, if there's parasites, that can really signal a need to detox. So when we look at detox, like, knowing all and I really feel like, Scott, I mean, first of all, your background's amazing. So we both got black, so I love that. But you're such a researcher. Just eat up information, and you're so good at really deciphering. So I highly recommend the listener to go check out betterhealthguy.com, one of the top blogs and resources for Lyme disease. So kudos for you. But with all you know and all you've absorbed, when you say, okay, let's detox, what does that look like outside of the environment that you mentioned?
So at a high level, I would say detoxification is certainly to avoid everything. We talked about that, but then I see it as binding, draining, mineralizing, and strategizing. So for me, that's binding is incorporating one or more binding agents to help the body excrete toxins and not reabsorb them through enterohepatic recirculation. Then we have drainage, which is supporting the organs of elimination, particularly looking at the liver, the kidney, the lymphatic system, the ground matrix or extracellular matrix, the colon. The third piece of that is mineralizing, and so flooding the body with healthy minerals. I think that oftentimes is very helpful as well. And then the last, and sometimes people don't need to even do this, but it's what I call strategize, which is really getting very specific solutions to specific toxins that may be more contributors to a person's symptom picture. And so the first three are kind of more general, putting a detox program in place. And then people may have very specific individualized medicine kinds of needs that they need to look at something. And so then they may need to strategize more specifically.
And to identify that, are you talking lab tests, talking energetic testing, both, or something else?
Well, so what I would say is the first piece is the binders, the drainage, and the minerals. So, looking at things like, let's talk a little about the binders first. So Toxicity Supreme, BioPure Zeobind, I think are great. We've got the new microbe formulas, the bioactive carbons, which I had my 2 capsules just before we had this discussion. And so I think there's a number of binders that are great, but some of the ones that I really like, again, Toxicity Supreme, the Zeobind, I'm exploring now the new bioactive carbons as well. But I think we need those in place to help pull toxins out of the body so that they're not reabsorbed as they get concentrated in the bile, pushed out through the gallbladder, move through the digestive tract, they oftentimes can get reabsorbed. And so Dr. Shade has the new Ultra binder as well. There's a lot of these binders out there, but I think that almost everyone dealing with something like Lyme or mold exposure should be on some kind of binder. When you're talking about mold exposures particularly, then cholestyramine sometimes can also be helpful in some cases. And so that's a pharmaceutical that people really need to talk with their doctors about. And then when we move on from the binders, we also need to layer in things to support drainage. This is another area that surprisingly people don't often seem to think about. And so, the body comes equipped with liver, kidneys, lymphatics, colon, all of these things to help us in terms of getting toxins out of the system. And so what are we doing to support the liver? BioRay Liver Life, energetics, hepatic tone, Pecana's ApoHepat. There's a number of things that can be done there. Kidneys, Pecana's Renalix is great. I think I just heard you mention Renalix on one of your shows on Facebook Live in the last week or so. Sophia Health or Sophia Nutrition, they have a kidney tincture. Dr. Z has a great kidney tincture. Electrolytes, hydration, really critical. The lymphatic drainage piece, Pecana Iteres, I would say is one of my favorites in that realm. Walking, moving, rebounding, vibrational trainer, things that get us moving really affect the lymphatics. And even just walking, people think they're not making a lot of progress by walking, but it's a fantastic tool for moving the lymphatic system. And then the extracellular matrix, looking at things like Mundipur from Pecana or drainage tone from energetics. I think that's also important just to help the body be able to support the excretion of these toxins. And so looking at the binders, number one, coming in with some drainage support. I think that's important. Minerals is the third piece. And I think if you look at people who have cryptopyrroluria, for example, or KPU, HPU, oftentimes part of the reason that we are more heavy metal toxic is that we've had a long-term deficiency in certain minerals like zinc, for example. And if the body doesn't have the minerals that it needs, it tends to hold on to more of these heavy metals. And so bringing something into the program like the Quinton isotonic minerals or colloidal minerals from Genestra. There's a host of these mineral products that I think can be very helpful. I personally use the Quinton isotonic or the Genestra colloidal minerals pretty much every day. And so we've then got the binders, the drainage remedies, and the minerals. And then the specific interventions that we're talking about, that's where, if somebody shows from some of the testing that they've done that they have a specific issue with aluminum, for example, maybe then they incorporate silica, which is one of the tools that Dr. Klinghardt will often use. They may incorporate malic acid or magnesium malate. If they have a significant metal issue, maybe some of the products like NDF or NDF Plus from BioRay, those are some tools that I think are helpful. There's another product called HMD or heavy metal detox, which can be very helpful. And then just looking at from those results, what are some of the things that are stressing a person, and then what can they bring in to support detoxification of those remaining items? So maybe they need to focus on glycine, for example, to support chemical and solvent detoxification. And then this is an area where I often find some of the homeopathic options can be very helpful. So if you're dealing more with heavy metals, there's specific heavy metal products in the homeopathic realm that can be great. If you're dealing with pesticides, there's different products in that realm that can be very helpful as well. So there may be some cases where we have to kind of customize things to whatever toxins or exposures. If somebody worked on a farm where they had constant exposure to pesticides, they may need to tailor their detox protocol more to pesticides. But you always want to have the binders and the drainage remedies and the minerals in place. And certainly the binders and the drainage remedies, I think those are ones that we really can't have a lot of discussion about. Those are pretty critical things for people to incorporate into their programs.
So for identifying those more specifics, so they do the first three and then now more specifics, are you relying a little bit more on energetic testing? Are there certain laboratory tests that you like? Is some of it even history and like their past and kind of combining it all?
I think a lot of it does get supported by the more general binders, drainage, minerals. But then, I think looking at energetic testing oftentimes can be really helpful. Looking at the panel from, the GPL Tox or the GPL Mycotox from Great Plains or the US Biotech Environmental Pollutants Panel, those types of things to see what the exposures are. I do think that somebody's history is important. What exposures have they had throughout their lifetime? Have they worked in industry where they were exposed to more metals or more pesticides or things of that nature. So I think it's a combination of, looking at the testing that they've had done, both functional medicine testing, also energetic testing, looking at the symptoms, but certainly to your point, I think the history is certainly critical as well.
All right. So we've got detoxifying, supporting the organs you talked about. Definitely a huge fan of the pacana that you were mentioning.
They're amazing, yeah.
Yeah, they just seem to work really well. Are there any other specific things other than some of the supplements you mentioned for toxicity? I mean, are you like a fan of saunas, or are there any other ways to really eliminate toxins or help speed the process up?
So I do personally like far infrared sauna. I think sweating is great, but I would say there's a place and a time for sauna therapy. And so if someone isn't getting their detoxification pathways opened up, I think sauna can be problematic. And so people think they're sweating and everything's coming out in the sweat and that's a good thing, which it is, but they don't often realize that toxins can be mobilized internally as well. And so once you mobilize those toxins internally, the body then has to do something with them, because those are not all getting out in the sweat. So it comes back again to the binders, the drainage remedies, liver, kidney, lymph support, colon, all of those things. And so I think sauna can be a good option sometimes later in treatment, once the detox program is put in place, once the adrenals are supported, once the person's able to start sweating. I think that people can be too aggressive with sauna, especially early on in a protocol. So that's something they should really coordinate with their doctor as well. I do use an ionic foot bath once or twice a week on average as well, just to continue supporting detoxification, more for the heavy metals with that particular intervention. I do like some of the EMF mats and the biomat and things like that are more general health supporting circulation type tools. I personally did feel like they were helpful in supporting some detoxification for me as well. When I first started those tools, I had to increase my binders a bit. I felt some detox reactions. I'm a huge fan of coffee enemas. People don't like to talk about that either, but if there's one tool that really helped over the years with my inflammation and pain, particularly with the mold exposure and the Lyme and all of that, coffee enemas were huge. And so again, the more we can do to unburden the body of toxins, the better off we will be, and the more the body can support us in doing what it was really designed to do. So I would probably say from a detox perspective, coffee enemas were my number one tool. And then I try to incorporate as much in a day as I can without getting too focused on it. So I have lots of things that I need to be doing, but I can do oil pulling while I'm in the shower several times a week, for example. So I do oil pulling a few times a week. And then I think I'm not a fan of, the genetic SNPs tell the story or tell the entire story, but there are certain cases where, exploring with someone who's knowledgeable in that realm, exploring your, potential methylation issues, things in that nature, that some nutrient support can be helpful. I don't think it's a magic bullet. And I think that, as we focus on detox particularly, we're really removing a lot of the things that are causing the genes to express in the way that they are. But I do think that that there is a place, once we've done the basics, detoxification and so on, to consider possibly incorporating nutrients that can help with some of these methylation processes, for example.
Yep. Love that. Got my coffee enema in this morning because I know everybody wanted to know that. So huge fan of that. But yeah, Scott, I went down the rabbit hole of the genetics, and it still ended up coming back to so much of like what we do today impacts, it seems to almost trump what our blueprint, genes more longer term says. So
Yeah, I totally agree. And unfortunately, the challenge that I see is, if you have 9 SNPs that are potentially issues, you may then have 9 new supplements to incorporate. And I've tried that a couple of times over the years. And then when things feel a little bit off, it's challenging to then figure out, okay, which of these 9 new things was the thing that caused it? And so I think people still have to be very methodical about introducing things in that realm as well, because it's usually not one supplement when you start going down that path.
Yep. And it's just limited knowledge we have so far with genetics. I look in 5 or 10 years, I would imagine the genetic world is going to be run by artificial intelligence at such we probably can't even fathom what that looks like in 5 or 10 years. So I think we're just scratching that surface, now, but just personally where I feel. So, as we wrap this interview up, Scott, is there any last words or any final thoughts that you want to leave the listener with? This is definitely, I know, going to be one of those interviews that they're going to go back and re-listen to, because there's so much great content that you covered and so many great tips. But I mean, how do you want to wrap this up here?
You know, I first want to say that I appreciate the work that you're doing with the summits, with your podcasts. I mean, you put a ton of great information out there. And so I think your efforts to educate people are really, really helpful and make people feel empowered. And I certainly appreciate having that resource available to also share with people. And so, you know, chronic illness and all that comes with it is certainly challenging, but there are solutions out there to help people move towards health. And so I think it's important that we are hopeful, that we feel empowered. You know, events like the Chronic Lyme Disease Summit number 3 certainly help to illuminate a lot of those tools that people can incorporate. And so I think it's just really great that you're doing this work, and I appreciate it very much. And then I want to also mention the Limelight Foundation, which we touched on at the beginning of this conversation. So Limelight Foundation is an organization that offers treatment grants to children and young adults 25 years and under. We just passed $3 million in treatment grants to people that are dealing with Lyme disease. And so if people are listening and they're in need of a treatment grant or in a position to support that work, please visit us at limelightfoundation.org. And then my last 3 words would be detox, detox, detox.
Wait, was detox mentioned at all today?
It was.
So important though, so important. Just great information. Thank you so much, Scott, for taking time out of your busy day to do this interview. You, like I said, you put out great content. Highly recommend the listener to go to your website, betterhealthguy.com, Better Health Guy. And yeah, just so appreciate just your heart, but what you've done to really help the Lyme disease and other chronic illness, category for people.
Thanks so much, Dr. J. I appreciate you as well.
Awesome. Well, we'll see you on the next interview. I'm Dr. J. Davidson. Maximum blessings. I hope you love that interview and are getting a ton of value from the Chronic Lyme Disease Summit number 3. I know it can seem like a lot of information and possibly even be overwhelming. By popular request, popular demand, I've created an at-home self-guided Lyme disease program, which might be a great option for you to help where you can do it at your own time. So it's LymeDiseaseProgram.com. For those that are interested and you just want one-on-one coaching, that is available too at drjdavidson.com.